Good morning. My name is Matthew Ross, and this is my SY 414 Social Movements presentation, my show and tell. And I'm sorry about the circumstances, but we're working with what we got, and hopefully I can upload this video to YouTube. My last one was too long. Anyway, we'll get right into it. So the social movement that I've decided to work on, and I will send you this presentation, my PowerPoint. You'll get a copy of it. Hopefully you can look at it as you are watching this video. But the movement I've decided to focus on is called the Idle No More movement, one we're all very familiar with in our class, but one that everyone should be familiar with because of why it was started. And I'll get into that. The reason why I chose this particular social movement is because as I read up on it, these two names really stood out to me. Tina Fontaine and Jordan Anderson. Their cases are horrific and should have never happened. We'll start with Tina Fontaine. She's from Sagkeeng First Nation in Manitoba, and her situation was she was killed by a man who eventually got charged for second-degree murder, but she was killed. She was wrapped up in plastic wrap and then wrapped in a duvet cover, her corpse, and thrown into the Red River in Manitoba. And you know, we have to recognize she's a human as well. She's like, we're all humans, and this man who killed her, he deserves to serve his time for what he's done. A horrific crime. But he ended up serving 2 years in jail. And then in August of that year, 2 years after the actual incident, it was brought back to court, and a month after that he was released, and the Crown, aka the government, refused to repeal the case or reopen the case, and he's now a free man walking around Canada, and that just should not happen. So that's the first case. Prayers go out to Tina Fontaine's family. Also, the second name that really brought me and my heart into this movement was Jordan Anderson, part of the Norway House Cree Nation in Manitoba as well. And his situation was he was born in a hospital with a very complex medical situation, but one they knew how to deal with and to sustain his life. Anyway, they knew he had this medical condition from his birth, and it, you know, from birth, the federal and provincial government were kind of fighting over who was going to pay for his medical expenses as he was able to move home. As this fight was going on, Jordan was still being treated in a hospital, and from birth all the way until he was 5 years old, he stayed in that hospital and ended up dying in that hospital because of this medical condition. And he was unable to see, you know, his hometown, where his family grew up, and where he should have grown up, where he could have grown up if the provincial or federal government decided, I care about this boy just as much as any other Canadian boy. So that's where the issue lies, is, you know, finding ways to adjust policy so that these kids can be cared for. And you know, in Tina's situation, the man should be prosecuted properly, and in Jordan's situation, that just shouldn't happen. The federal and provincial government have to come to a decision so that he can live his best life, and that didn't happen, and that's why it was in the news stories. And although the news stories, they're there when these situations happen, it's just not enough, and that's why this Idle No More movement is so key to bringing justice to this indigenous population. So the movement, it began with colonization, obviously, the exploitation and invasion of the colonialists coming to Canada and North America, but I'm just focusing on Canada. And the Idle No More movement is the effort to seek the inherent right to sovereignty that these indigenous people have in their land, according to the Canadian policy, as well as reinstitute traditional laws and protect the lands and waters from complete corporate destruction, which they're doing, and which no one's really batting an eye at because people seem to not care about these policies made so that we can protect these Indigenous people in Canada. So I'll give you the efforts of these colonists to assimilate these Indigenous people was basically taking their culture and wanting to throw it out in the garbage. And this picture perfectly depicts that. Over here you've got them as they were going into the residential schools, and this is after they've been through all the residential schooling. As you can see, they've been stripped of their culture, stripped of anything their family would have taught them, and they're taught these new ways by, trying to get this capitalist mentality into their heads and wiping them of their languages, of their culture, essentially. And what I would like to think of it as cultural genocide, which is terrible. It shouldn't happen to anyone, or any culture, any population. So the effects of all of this over time was the Indigenous people were put into reserves and residential schools and other legislation that kind of limits their participation in the Canadian society. So here's a stat coming your way, since the 1800s, academic research shows that there's been an Indigenous population loss of 62 to 90% all along the British Columbia coast. And that's just simply capitalists thinking, oh, the coast is a perfect region for attraction, tourism. They're just money signs going off in their head. So, and whereas the Indigenous people are thinking these lands are great, there's a water source there's enough food because the animals love to be around the water source, but the capitalists take a whole different stance on why that region would be valuable to them. And of course they get what they want, and kind of ship the Indigenous people out to their little region in what they called reserves, in which a lot of Indigenous people live right now. Excuse me. So in order to extinguish this problem, in which the policy makers of Canada thought were the Indians, quote unquote, is to make them like us. And that's what assimilation, the efforts of assimilation did. And it kind of did rid the Indigenous people of their culture in that time period. And now their Idle No More movement is kind of fighting back and trying to regain the rights to their culture, which everyone should have, especially in a country like Canada, true, strong, and free. It doesn't seem so free for these Indigenous people. So that's kind of a little quagmire for the Canadian government. It says here, according to Stats Canada, that the Indigenous people have over 70 languages spoken in North America. So that just says they're so rich in culture, and what we're trying to do is rip that from them and feed them our culture, and it doesn't make sense to me. It shouldn't be the only option for the Canadian government. So the aim of the Idle No More movement, they've got an agenda here that I've got on this presentation. Number one is fixing Bill C-45. That was the Stephen Harper administration kind of issued that bill, and what that was them just making it easier for businesses or corporations to kind of push through their lands without any strict environmental assessment. Environmental assessment meaning, they're going into reserve lands, the lands they put aside for the Indigenous people, extracting those resources so that they can make a quick buck. But the Indigenous people are not being compensated for that, even though it's their land. It would be like Canada going into the US, extracting oil, and then bringing it back to Canada. That would be a big no-no, and Trump would be all over that, shooting over the. Sorry, I shouldn't go that far, but that's my analogy for that. It just shouldn't happen, and so that is Bill C-45. Number 2 is collective rights and true democracy. So just having the rights that they were promised and being able to have proportionate democracy or proportionate representation through the indigenous people. Sorry. Or for the indigenous people. The third one is no development on their territory, something that Bill C-45 made easier for these businesses and corporations to kind of crash through those walls. And that's why you see these indigenous people putting up barriers to their lands. And it's kind of brought in this military force from the Canadian government. And they're really just going against their constitution, which I touch on in the 4th part of their agenda, which is recognize Aboriginal title and rights, which is found in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. And we're really not recognizing these rights and titles that we've given to these indigenous people, and that really just doesn't make sense to me. They're our treaties that we've made with the indigenous culture, or with the indigenous people, and we're going against those treaties, which is the 5th part of the agenda, is honor Canadian treaties. They've honored their part of the treaty, their side of the deal, so why can't the Canadian government? And the last one, which should be so obvious to anyone, is actively resist violence against women. It has to be put in there because of cases like Tina Fontaine. People are dying and women are being mistreated. They're turning to substance abuse, and it's awful for their culture and for us, really. It just doesn't look good on the Canadian government to have these lives lost for no real reason. So the way that the social movement has taken place is through mass mobilizations. There's a huge presence online that, I've put a tweet, copy and pasted a tweet onto this PowerPoint presentation, and it's just one example of recent Idle No More hashtag, and it's just trying to push this movement, have people recognize that there's an actual issue at hand here and that this needs to be dealt with now. So we need those mass mobilizations to happen, or else the Crown is going to get what they want and continue to get what they want. And it's not just online mobilizations, it's offline mobilizations. They're the one shown in the previous presentation where they stood on King Street blocking traffic. That's happened before with Via Rail. They protested in front of a train, they protested on streets, they protested on Parliament Hill, and hopefully it's getting into the Crown's head that this is a real issue, we need to do something about this. So that's why this movement is so serious and so necessary for the Indigenous population. So I go on to say more about mobilization. I have the tweet posted here. You'll see it in the presentation, the PowerPoint. And the way I kind of relate this to the readings, through this McNally quote, the more alienated we are, the more we can treat our world and ourselves as detached, lifeless things with a commercial potential. So what he's talking about there is capitalism and how it alienates the proletariat from their work or from themselves. And that's basically what we've done with the Indigenous people throughout the last 100 years, is we're trying to assimilate them, we're trying to rid them of their culture, and we're trying to push our culture into their brains so that they can be one with us and so that we can have no more issues. But that's, in my opinion, a terrible way of treating these people who are so rich in culture. It just doesn't make sense to me. And that's why this Idle No More movement is so serious. So I have a video attached. Thank you for letting me do this. And yeah, have a great summer.